Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to this program this afternoon at the Wilson Center. We have a great panel today in which we'll discuss probably one of the boldest pieces of legislation or proposed legislation that's come out in recent years, addressing the relationship between U.S. and China, as well as the U.S. economy. And it'll have a large impact on the global economy as well if it does pass and if it's enacted. So we're talking, of course, about the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act of 2021, which passed the Senate with a strong bipartisan majority vote earlier this month or in early June. And the House is working on its own version of a similar piece of legislation, and we'll see where these two pieces of legislation end up. But some people in Washington think that there will be a strong consensus that forms around something similar that emerges out of Congress and will be put before President Biden in the White House eventually. So we'll hear more about that from our panelists today. The act is as it's written in the Senate so far, the act allocates $250 billion to enhance U.S. competition and industrial strength in fields like technology, robotics, manufacturing, and these other areas, with the aim of competing with China, which is currently the world's second largest economy, but is predicted to become the largest economy in around 10 or 15 years if things stay on their current trajectory. We know that U.S. China relations have gotten much tenser in the last 3 to 4 years. And right now, there doesn't seem to be many signs of that tension abating. And some people have interpreted this act as another piece of the U.S. of the sort of a new, what's called a new Washington consensus approach to China. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panels here on the different aspects of the act. We could start with Anna Ashton, who's the Vice President for Government Affairs at the U.S. China Business Council. Anna has examined the economic language in the act very closely and done some analysis of sort of the larger economic picture that the act tries to address. So Anna, would you like to start?
Absolutely, thanks, Ed. So I wanted to start by just kind of setting the scene a little bit in terms of what the legislative landscape on the Hill looks like when it comes to China. We all know that we're in a highly divided and gridlocked political climate, and concern over the challenges posed to U.S. interests by a rising China has really become the most significant issue upon which most lawmakers, both Republican and Democrat, can agree. As a result, we've seen an unprecedented volume of legislative proposals that are either focused on China or have a significant China angle, many with major implications for all aspects of the relationship. In the last Congress, the 116th Congress, so 2019 and 2020, more than 550 China-related bills and resolutions were introduced. And in the current Congress, which kicked off in late January of this year, we've already seen about 230 China-related proposals, many of them introduced or sponsored by members of both parties. To put this prolific bipartisan activity in perspective for myself, my team and I went back and took a look at legislation that dealt with terrorism in the wake of the September 11th attacks in 2001. And in that Congress, the 107th Congress, there was very strong bipartisan support for efforts to ensure that the United States never suffered a similar attack again. Congress overwhelmingly passed sweeping legislation with significant ramifications, and votes from Republicans and Democrats made that happen. And yet the total number of terror-related proposals introduced at that time was just 130. So 130 proposals to address terrorism in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, versus more than 550 proposals to address various perceived threats and challenges emanating from China in 2019 and 2020, and already at least 230 in the first 6 months of this Congress. By this measure, The sense of China as a menace among members of Congress right now would seem to far exceed the sense of Al Qaeda as a menace in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. A caveat, though, China legislation should also be viewed in the context of the totality of Congress's work. So there were 16,000 bills and resolutions introduced in the last Congress. And as is customary, only a fraction of those, 344, became law. And of the 344 laws that were passed, only 15 were China related. So again, right now, while we have an awful lot of China related proposals already circulating in this Congress, they too are actually still just a fraction of the thousands of bills and resolutions introduced since January overall. Nonetheless, though, China is a really significant hot button issue, as we all know, and even things that aren't necessarily really about China these days are about China, especially on the Hill. It seems to be the go-to rhetorical device for rallying bipartisan support for anything and everything. In a recent podcast for the New York Times, David Sanger spoke about the Senate's recent passage of this bill that we're talking about today, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, and he said, if there's one key lesson that emerges from really the non-debate over this bill, it's that America needs, again, as it always has, an adversary to be the organizing thought for things we probably needed to do anyway. The president himself has seemed to acknowledge this dynamic, albeit not in as many words, not as directly. He applauded the bipartisan passage in the Senate of the sweeping U.S. Innovation and Competition Act on June 8th, pointing out high-tech research and development proposals in the bill that mirror his American jobs plan. Biden's statement didn't mention China, but it clearly invoked the China challenge indirectly, noting that the United States is in competition to lead the 21st century and must maintain its position as other countries invest in their own high-tech R&D capabilities. And so, of course, this bipartisan preoccupation with China, whether as threat, competition, or leverage for getting other things done, is exactly the context in which the Senate passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act in early June, a bill that at its foundation had Senator Schumer and Republican Senator Young's Endless Frontier Act, and that also includes the core focus, I think, of what we'll be discussing today, the Strategic Competition Act. The Endless Frontier Act really wasn't originally a bill about China at all. It was framed as a means of responding to China's competitive challenge, but the main focus of that portion, and arguably of most of the USICA package, is to bolster domestic research and manufacturing in key sectors to ensure the United States maintains the strong economy and position of technological leadership we have today. USICA authorizes appropriation of nearly $250 billion to do this. But USICA is a really big bill. The text runs to nearly 2,400 pages, and within it, certainly within the Strategic Competition Act section, there also are a host of provisions that reimagine the United States diplomatic, economic, and defense relationships with China. This includes provisions that implicate the commercial relationship, as well as scientific and academic engagement that ties to the commercial relationship. So the Strategic Competition Act is actually the product of bipartisan efforts from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And although it seemed to move quickly and come together quickly earlier this year before it was folded into the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, there were actually many months of work in the last Congress that culminated in two separate partisan bills from which the text is drawn. Some of the key provisions that we've been keeping an eye on because of their trade and commercial implications included a section on investing in a competitive future and countering Chinese influence, which authorizes $15 million to be spent by the State Department to basically help small and medium-sized businesses shift their supply chains out of China. It also creates a government body to review the Chinese government's efforts to coerce or intimidate US businesses into censoring themselves, which is sort of in the values bucket of proposals that we're seeing from lawmakers concerned with whether US companies are upholding or promoting American values, or if they are compromising those values for the sake of their business interests in the Chinese market. There's a US alliances and diplomacy section, which I won't speak about in any detail, except to mention that there's a piece of that that has to do with US engagement in multilateral organizations, especially standard setting bodies, which of course is important in the commercial context. There's a human rights provision or section of provisions that intersects with business, though less so than in the EAGLE Act, which is the House answer in many ways to the Strategic Competition Act. In particular, there are provisions that address human rights concerns in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet, One of them expands existing Uyghur human rights related sanctions to include individuals or entities contributing to forced labor in the region. And additionally, the bill would require a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, but allow athlete participation. That boycott could be waived by the Secretary of State, and it is, only calling for a strictly diplomatic boycott, but still that could have some pretty significant commercial implications. And finally, there's an economic statecraft portion. The Strategic Competition Acts would create an intellectual property violators list and PRC subsidies list, outlining Chinese entities that have infringed on a country's intellectual property or are subsidized by the Chinese government to gain an unfair advantage against their global competitors. It also requires the State Department to report on how China may be using Hong Kong's special status to circumvent certain US economic laws and protections. And then one more piece that I want to highlight that isn't directly trade and commerce related, but has potential ramifications for business is language that would direct the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to review certain foreign gifts to educational institutions. It basically amends CFIUS jurisdiction to include gifts of $1 million or more from foreign persons. And it's one of many proposals we've seen from lawmakers that would expand the scope of what CFIUS does, with some with more direct implications for business than this, but still. And I think I will stop there so that we can get into other sections, but thanks.
Thanks, Anna. And I just want to tell everyone watching right now that if you have questions that you'd like to ask any of the panelists or ask the panel in general, please email the questions to china@wilsoncenter.org. That's china@wilsoncenter.org, easy to remember. So next up, we have Melissa Griffith, who's a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center, and she'll address some of the scientific and technological angles of the Act. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad I didn't go first because I didn't have to give an overview of this entire document, which, as Anna has pointed out, is quite expansive and covers pretty much everything you can think of that deals with technology, national competition, innovation, and China, all sort of rolled into one. So an incredibly expansive document. I sit at the intersection of technology and national security. So when I'm reading this particular act, that's sort of the lenses that I have on, and that I'll sort of use to guide us through a couple of key points that I'd like to make to start off this discussion. I'm going to hit 4 different topics as I kind of go through. The first 3 are just very much about the text in this document and what it does and how it situates into broader efforts in the United States and sort of the Biden administration's efforts, so how we understand that. And the last one is a little bit more of a note of caution, a framing context type statement about how we think about China technology and the way we talk about that going forward. So the first thing I want to talk about is, I think, something that Anna brought up, which is sort of the idea that this is something the United States should have been doing anyway, and China's a really good excuse to do it. So when we're looking at the context of this bill, there's been a large thrust over the past sort of 4 or so years in the United States in relation to China, which is a geopolitical competitor or someone we're jostling with, whichever terminology you prefer there, a jostler or a competitor or a strategic adversary, however aggressive you want to be in your terminology. It's true that exists. It's true in that relationship that technology is a key component of that jostling and brings with it a lot of strategic advantages and economic advantages and tension points. The US approach historically had been largely reactionary, which was to identify particular areas where we were concerned about Chinese technology, Chinese behavior, and target those areas in ways of trying to deny access to markets, limit the spread and development of that technology. That tend to be the biggest thrust of the US sort of approach in this space. There have been efforts underneath that to sort of move away from a just say no to China type approach. And you saw those in the most recent NDAA, you saw that in the CHIPS Act, you saw that in 5G legislation, trying to say, no, this can't just be reacting to China. We need to build out US and allied strengths in this space. Think about getting our own neighborhood, our own house in order. And that's exactly what this pretty historic bill is doing across a wide range of technologies, focusing on the innovation, the competition, the development of industry, the ecosystem that supports sort of US industry in this space. And that's a pretty historic shift given the sheer scope of it. Those efforts had always existed, but were pretty siloed. And when you look at the kind of technology at play here, it's everything from AI to 5G, semiconductors to specific domains like space and cybersecurity. So quite expansive, but really looking at saying, where's the US advantage? How do we build out a US ecosystem Sometimes this is called industrial policy. You can use market craft if industrial policy is a term we're a little allergic to in the current political environment. But how do we build out that market craft to create a strong US ecosystem at home? And that's how we compete with China. The second thing I kind of want to point to here is that in that effort, bringing this much more background to our national strengths, there's a recognition that this has to be done cohesively, collectively. And you see that in the different types of levers being pulled here. It's everything from the standards bodies and conversations about international governance to investing in providing financial incentives for developing or deploying certain types of technology, to reshaping the way we do research in the country and we support research and development through the NSF, to putting security front and center in those processes. All of those are really different levers that we're seeing the government looking to pull at once. So it's very cohesive in that shift. The third thing I would want to point to, which I think Anna also addressed a little bit earlier, is that this is not just a US conversation. And that is very much in sync with kind of the broader feel of these policy issues in the United States as well. You have focus on those international governance type issues such as standards. You also have specific calls to look at allied core strategic partners in terms of building out supply chain security and availability and how we consider their role in our broader security and our ecosystem. And then you have conversations about how to understand the development of these technologies globally outside of our traditional historic security partners. And there's a real focus on the ways that we build out technology and infrastructure in regions such as Africa and Latin America as well. So there's a real widening of the aperture. There's a big US push, and then a very strong focus on where we fit globally and the ways we can support a global set of initiatives, not get in each other's way, step on each other's feet, and build out systems that we would like to see globally. So those are the sort of three, what do we see in this bill around technology policy? Very consistent with what we see out of the White House, and no surprise that we saw the Biden administration sort of put a thumb of approval in their statement around kind of the scope and scale and this real shift of attention to US strengths. The kind of note of caution that I'd actually like to end my statement with is this term U.S. China technology competition. Often when we have these conversations, technology is singular, and we talk about it as if it's a singular axis. That makes sense. It is a monolith at the level of you're talking about just geopolitical environment we found ourselves in. There is a US China technology competition going on there. The problem is, and I think we're seeing this borne out in this bill, and this will tell us sort of how successful we will be, is those technologies are not the same that we're talking about. They don't impact US power, US economy, US security in the same way. China and the US aren't situated in those markets in the same way. The industries don't function in the same way. And I'll give you a couple examples. And that level of granularity is where the rubber meets the road. That's where we're going to be successful, is our ability to take these as technologies, not as technology. So in this bill alone, you have conversations about domains of competition. You have the space chapter specifically looking at space competition, the geopolitics and technology present there. You have cyberspace and concerns around cybersecurity and creating more resources and critical response capabilities in that space. So you have competition domains. You have discussions of what we would call sea change technologies. So these are things like AI that affect a wide swath of activity. They're sort of sometimes likened to the new electricity, where their impact is going to be incredibly dispersed, pretty novel in many ways, from everything to how we operate our militaries, to the ways we generate value, to how a company like Amazon schedules shipments. Very, very kind of systemic impacts. Those are sea change technologies, AI. You then have foundational technologies. And an example of this is semiconductors, with the CHIPS Act and funding for that being in this bill. And there you're really talking about a piece of technology upon which everything else we care about rests, right? So whether you're talking about automobiles, AI, 5G, quantum computing, your satellite that you're using in space, the phone that you're using to call into this call, all of those things rest on this one foundational technology. It's a critical point of failure. Those are semiconductor chips. They look pretty different. And then all the way over, we're suddenly talking about critical infrastructure challenges and concerns around critical infrastructure, a totally new sector of technology and technology concern. And that's where questions of 5G, Open RAN, the 5th generation of mobile networks come up. And I think this kind of distinction is important, not just because, yes, these are different technologies, but if you're talking about competing in a domain, concerns around sea change, critical foundational technologies, or critical infrastructure, those are different policy concerns in each of those spaces. And really importantly, the US and China occupy different positions in each of those markets. And you can see that most starkly with semiconductors and 5G, where in 5G, China is an incumbent player with firms like Huawei and ZTE. There's a real concern about a choke point in something called the radio access network. It's the least diverse part of the 5G network. Think cellular towers. When you're driving down the road, you're like, that is a very large tower. That's the radio access network components. There's a choke point there, very few vendors. And this creates a whole series of concerns about how available that technology will be, how secure that technology will be, with China as a significant incumbent player there and not as many US players. That's one set of concerns around critical infrastructure. The semiconductor conversation is about the United States and our allies as holding really strong incumbent positions. The security and availability of supply concern is much more downstream to support other technology, not the infrastructure itself. And the primary concern is about maintaining certain forms of leadership, building out where we've lost some leadership, and managing a rising China, not an incumbent player China. So I think as we move forward, it's just important to decouple this technology. It's not a monolith. We have a series of conversations happening, and they're sort of woven throughout this very expansive bill. They're talking about all of them. But the real test will be to the degree we can actually get down below the level of technology and talk about, for example, supply chain resilience and security in each of these subcomponents and do that meaningfully.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. There were some great insights in there on what a lot of people think is sort of the most intense field in which China and the US are competing, although I know you addressed the language around that also. So just a reminder for anyone who wants to send in questions, please do so at china@wilsoncenter.org. We're already getting some great questions, and we should have plenty of time to get around to many of the questions. So next we'll go to Abe Denmark, who will address the military affairs component and the Asian alliance component of the Act and what kinds of impacts we might see if some version of this Act were to be put in place later on. Abe? And Abe is the director of the Asia program at the Wilson Center.
Thanks so much, Ed, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to put on my Kissinger Institute hat at the Wilson Center, and great to work with my colleagues from across the center. I wanted to use this time that I have to discuss the security and implications of this, as well as the implications for allies and partners. But there's really no way I could do it justice within the 10 minutes that I have. It's an incredibly dense document. There's a lot of ambition there. So I'm going to, with apologies to Ed, speak in as broad a way I can so as to give the best sense of where I think things are and what I think that the Act reflects about attitudes in Congress about China and about U.S. strategy in the region. Broadly speaking, I think there's a broad recognition, one, that the United States is engaged in an intense military competition with China, that our conventional military advantages vis-a-vis China are diminishing, and that we need to do something about it. This being the Strategic Competition Act, mostly coming out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it does not address the hard military issues that would be addressed by other committees, at least in the same way, but it does speak to a lot of the same issues. And I think you see a lot of the themes of what's been coming out of Senate Armed Services Committee and others, the idea that we need to do more to maintain our advantages, that we can no longer maintain an advantage just by legacy systems. That China's robust, decades-long military modernization campaign has been giving them some significant improvements in their conventional military capability, and there's something we need to do about it. But as we'll see in other issue areas, when it comes to China, when it comes to allies and partners, there's going to be broad agreement on the problem. But when we start talking about what to do about it, then you start to see some cleavages within different parts of Congress, and which I think reflect broadly disagreements within the academic community and policy community on these issues. The one area that I think is of in which there's the least disagreement, which I'll start first on, is on allies and partners. There is a broad sense that the United States relationships with its allies and partners, especially in the Indo-Pacific, is critical to our competition with China, that they're an incredible strategic advantage of the United States, but we need to do more with those allies and partners, both in terms of empowering them and making them more capable of doing more in terms of defending themselves, in terms of contributing to international norms in the security sector and elsewhere, but also in encouraging them to do more with one another, to encourage greater binding and cooperation amongst our allies and partners. So throughout this document, throughout the Strategic Competition Act, you see the document return again and again to encouraging the Quad to do more, the Quad relationship between the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. The importance of ASEAN and the United States to work more with ASEAN and encourage ASEAN to take more of a leadership role on security issues in Southeast Asia, but also encouraging more cooperation amongst these countries, between ASEAN, India, Taiwan, and New Zealand on a wide variety of security issues, but all having to do something with China and responding to the challenges, the security challenges that China plays. Even bringing in countries that have been less enthusiastic in our competitive aspects with China in recent years, Thailand and the Philippines, encouraging that cooperation, both in terms of military, in terms of deeper defense engagement between our defense industries, between our defense sectors, but also between our defense establishments more broadly, both in terms of promoting human rights, in terms of maritime security, basically across the board, seeing that these allies and partners are a critical element of American power, but will only be effective if we're working together, if the sum is greater than each part individually, including the United States. There seems to be pretty broad agreement there. Once you get past that, there's some pretty significant disagreements within the Congress, and I think it's reflecting that the broad agreement that we've seen, bipartisan agreement that we've seen about the China challenge, starts to disintegrate a bit, or at least dissipate a bit, once you start getting into, okay, we agree that there's a problem, what are we going to do about it? So for example, on defense issues, there's a sense that's shared, I think, across most Democrats and Republicans, that our defense capabilities need to be modernized, that we need to shift our investments to enhance our regional force posture, to invest in greater technologies that are tailored towards the challenges of the Indo-Pacific. Yet, when the Biden administration's budget came out on defense issues, when the defense budget proposal from the Biden administration came out, there was pretty significant criticism amongst Republicans and amongst some Democrats, especially when it came to the Navy budget and how the Pentagon wanted to fund the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Beyond that, questions of cooperation or competition, I think there's some pretty significant cleavages. I would point folks to the recent hearing that you can find, the recent markup, I should say, of the so-called Eagle Act that was marked up the other day at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, in which partisan disagreements became pretty pronounced, especially over questions of cooperation, whether or not China is an existential threat, or there's room for cooperation, especially in fields like climate change, space, and other issues that seem to bring in baggage of partisan disagreements on other issues not specifically related to China. So to me, the question going forward on this piece and on this piece, the Strategic Competition Act, but all the other pieces of legislation that we've been talking about, is whether there's a happy medium, a central agreement on military investments, on policy prescriptions related to China, related to our allies and partners, that both sides can agree to. My sense is that when it comes to allies and partners, yes. There is a great deal of agreement, and opening up the aperture for greater cooperation between these countries across all elements of national power, not just in military and security sector, but broad cooperation, encouragement of those relationships, I think, is broadly felt. But when we get into more controversial issues, be it space, climate change, even in terms of defense budget, and which technologies we should have, there's, I think, going to be increasingly difficult negotiations to have. The last point I'd like to focus on is going to be Taiwan. And as with most allies and partners, I think there is broad agreement that we need to support Taiwan, that the United States needs to make defense articles and services that are necessary for its own self-defense available, that we need to enhance our economic relationship, our political engagement with them, but not major, there is no real support for major changes to the framework of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. However, I do think that we need to be careful on this one piece. And there was a portion of this act that really caught my eye when it came to Taiwan, declaring that the United States should carry out its relations with Taiwan and should not place any restrictions on the ability of officials of the Department of State and other U.S. government agencies to interact directly and routinely with counterparts in the Taiwan government, really in saying that it shouldn't be handled in a way that's different from any other foreign government. But then follow with a caveat to say this is not, should not be taken to mean that we're supporting restoring our diplomatic relations with Taiwan or altering our position on Taiwan's international status, which I don't entirely see as necessarily consistent between those two paragraphs. But I think it speaks to the broader question that's, I think many in Congress are going to have to wrestle with, that while we see the need to engage with Taiwan and enhance that relationship and make it more robust, more normalized, there's also, I think, a broad recognition that there needs to be, continue to be some degree of guardrails on that relationship, that we need to maintain the one China policy that we've had. But how that would actually work, how that ambition to enhance our relationship with Taiwan will run into some of the guardrails that we've had for the last several decades, I think is going to be difficult for some in the Congress, especially, to navigate. And I think we see that in the Strategic Competition Act. So going forward, when it comes to Taiwan, I expect there to be a very close watch on Congress of the executive branch to make sure that the executive branch is following the spirit of this act, of other acts, of other pieces of legislation coming out of the Congress on Taiwan. But at the same time, I think there's going to be a sense from Congress that while they want to do more, don't rock the boat too much. And how we cast that balance, I think, is going to be up to the executive branch, as it often is, to navigate the complexities of what Congress wants without going too far to upset the very important relationships that they're dealing with. I think I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Abe. And next, we'll turn to Robert Daly, who's the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. The Kissinger Institute is one of the organizers of the panel today, and I'm a fellow currently at the Institute myself. And again, if you have any questions, please email them over to china@wilsoncenter.org. And now Robert will talk about the Act and its relationship to diplomacy and combating Chinese influence. Robert?
Thanks, Ed. First, a few general comments. If after today's panel, some of our listeners want to get a better feel for the spirit behind the Innovation and Competition Act, what Congress is feeling, I want to refer you to section 3002 of the Act, the findings, which comes late, but it sort of lays out the basic strategic posture. This section is overlong, but it's helpful. And I think in total, it bespeaks a really quite well-informed Senate that has clearly thought long and hard about the relationship with China and has distilled some important guiding principles from those deliberations. This section, I think, quite usefully names the problem with China. It spells it out. Quote, "The People's Republic of China is leveraging its political, diplomatic, economic, military, technological, and ideological power to become a strategic, near-peer global competitor of the United States. The policies increasingly pursued by the PRC in these domains are contrary to the interests and values of the United States, its partners, and much of the rest of the world." Then go on to say that in response to this strategic decision of the Chinese Communist Party, the decision to step out into the world more assertively and to challenge the system, the United States has been compelled to re-examine and revise its strategy toward the PRC. So this is staking out the claim that it is China that has changed its ambitions, its policies and actions that has provoked this new phase in the relationship. The findings also spell out America's interests, clearly, helpfully, but not surprisingly: upholding a free and open international order, defending allies, promoting individual freedoms and human rights. This will all be familiar, but again, it's classic policy making. What's the problem? What are our interests? And it also spells out policy objectives. Most importantly, ensuring that the United States' global leadership role is sustained and its political system and major foundations of national power are postured for long-term political, economic, technological, and military competition with the PRC. So looked at as a whole, and this is following up on some of the things that Anna said, the bill shows that the U.S. looking at China is alarmed. It's afraid. That's not a word that the bill uses, but it pervades the whole thing. This is a bill that bristles with purpose, but not exactly with confidence. And I don't mean that as a criticism. The bill acknowledges that this is going to be a long, hard slog. Clearly also, the bill cements the idea that it is competition, especially in the technology and global leadership arenas, that is the determinative force in U.S. China relations going forward. We knew this. The era of engagement is over, but this is Congress putting its imprimatur on that idea. And then very importantly, the bill makes clear that this competition between the US and China is going to be about performance, is going to be about competence primarily, not about ideology. And interestingly, this is what Chinese official rhetoric has been saying too. This is a competition between which kind of system delivers more for its people. I think that raises a conceptual question for Americans. Are we idealists or utilitarians? Are we small d Democrats in the United States because we believe fundamentally in representative government, or because we believe democracy delivers the best material and technological outcomes? There's an interesting tension there, I think. Okay, influence. This question of combating Chinese influence in the United States in institutions and in communities. The goal of the bill, again, clearly stated, is to enable the people of the United States, including the private sector, civil society, universities, and other academic institutions, state and local legislators, and other relevant actors, to remain vigilant to the risks posed by the undue influence of the CCP in the United States. They then go on to say, having raised this alarm, but our goal is to implement measures to mitigate these risks while preserving opportunities for economic engagement, academic research, and cooperation in areas where the United States and PRC share interests. This, I think, there's obviously a tension there, but it's helpful. It means that Congress, after I think over much of the past 4 years overstating the influence, there's concerns about influence of China and the CCP in the United States, has heard from American universities, has heard from communities that say, we benefit from certain kinds of interaction with China. They're trying to have it both ways here. Abe suggested that there's a little bit of trying to have it both ways on the military side. We see that here as well. On diplomacy, the bill says that it is the sense of Congress that we need an increase in at least 200 foreign service officers around the world. So the centerpiece here is strengthening our diplomatic corps. It wants at least 200 additional FSOs to advance free, I'm quoting here, free, fair, and reciprocal trade and open investment environments for the United States companies, and to better articulate and explain United States policies. That, I want to point out, is the role of public diplomacy, articulating and explaining United States policies. Most notably, I think, on the diplomatic front, the bill calls for increased investment from the United States in overseas trade, encouraging American companies to invest in other parts of the world, lending in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, South, Southeast, and Central Asia, the Indo-Pacific and Oceania, the Arctic, everywhere. This bill recognizes that global diplomacy is an essential part of competing with China. Now here, there's another irony. This bill, from beginning to end, in ways that Anna and Melissa and Abe have already described, is a globalist bill to the core. It calls not just for American self-strengthening. It says that it is essential for us to work in all of these realms with other nations, with all other nations and regions. So this is a globalist bill that has come from an essentially anti-globalist Senate and Congress that is still not willing to consider joining CPTPP, and that is very wary of using globalist language generally, thinking that it's going to be rejected by the American people. But note that from the Republicans and Democrats, this is a globalist bill. A few more notable provisions on the diplomatic side. The bill authorizes an appropriation of $10 million in fiscal year 2022 for the Department of State to promote democracy in Hong Kong. Now, we all know where this is coming from. We are, I think, rightly horrified by what China has done in and to Hong Kong over the past year and a half. But China has made very clear that Hong Kong is another Chinese city. And I think that we should think twice in saying 10 million to promote democracy. This really is fairly direct interference in China's internal affairs. If Hong Kong is like any other Chinese city, why stop at Hong Kong? You know, why not Shanghai? And then lastly, $10 million for democracy promotion in Hong Kong. Given what's going on there, are we going to be endangering the recipients of these funds? Who gets this money from what China has identified as a black hand? Again, I understand the concern that informs this, but what signals does this send to China in particular? I think it strengthens their claim that the Hong Kong demonstrations did not reflect the true feelings of the Hong Kong people, but were orchestrated by overseas forces. We're playing into that. That doesn't have to be the final word on that topic, but I think it needs to be considered. Section 3304 of the bill calls for a large report on the corrupt activities of senior Chinese officials. A whole bunch of reports are supposed to be handed into Congress 180 days after this is enacted. And it goes into great detail about how we should spell out all of the corrupt activities within China and overseas of leading Chinese officials. If we can do this, we can pay for this bill by selling this report to the Chinese government, which would be highly interested. I don't know that we have the ability to do this, but this goes beyond, technological self-strengthening. We're looking now at Chinese corruption. It's an interesting impulse. Very importantly, Section 3502 calls for cooperation with China on strategic nuclear dialogue. There's a lot in here. There's not much on cooperation, but there's a great deal on trying to cooperate with China on new nuclear and arms limitations dialogues. I don't know if we are going to be, China has been pretty clear about its disinterest in this. Abe may have more to say about it. There's another question about whether in a bill that essentially calls China a bad actor in almost every other sphere, whether we are incentivizing China to be involved in this dialogue. So those are just a few of the other notes. What's not in the bill on the diplomacy side? There's almost nothing in here about America, with the exception of trying to start, nuclear talks with China. There's almost nothing on American diplomacy toward China itself. All of these increases in diplomacy have to do with American diplomacy around the rest of the world, countering Chinese disinformation campaigns, bringing other nations onto the American side in terms of economics, technology, these areas we've been talking about. Worldwide diplomacy, but nothing in here on what the role of diplomacy might be in joint, meaning U.S. China management of this bilateral relationship. It's all but silent on that question. So are we giving up on diplomacy with China as a tool for directing and managing this relationship, or do we just have no new ideas? It's the single, I think, most glaring silence in the bill. I just mentioned public diplomacy. There's a lot in this bill about providing more global public goods and public diplomacy directed toward the rest of the world to combat China's illiberal practices in various regions. But there's almost nothing in this bill on our public diplomacy, again, toward China. It calls for some funding of the Voice of America and RFA, but there's nothing in here about the key role of public diplomacy, which is trying to engage the Chinese people in a discussion about these issues, about making arguments to the Chinese people. Are we giving up on persuading there? Again, I would say a rather glaring omission. So there are many calls here, I think in toto, for countering China as a fundamental organizing and funding principle for the US government. That's sort of the broad thrust of this bill. But the bill is relatively silent on costs. You know, Melissa kept saying this bill is expansive. It's also expensive. If all of this were to be implemented, it doesn't have a Congressional Budget Office, a CBO score yet. The bill calls for informing Americans about the China challenge. It calls for strengthening their will. It calls for Democrats and Republicans to agree on how to fund this competition. But there's nothing in here about what that would really entail, especially in light of all of our other funding programs and our funding priorities. It makes the overall thrust of the bill is to make the China threat sound extremely dire. But at the end of the day, it doesn't answer, I think, the fundamental question: is it dire enough that we have to raise taxes to counter it? We don't get much there. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Robert. I noticed you used the phrase self-strengthening there, and I wonder if you meant it ironically, since we all know that the phrase self-strengthening in a China context refers to the Chinese intellectual movements at the end of the Qing dynasty, when they were trying to bolster China that had been weakened by, in the Chinese narrative, Western forces. So are we seeing the opposite? Are we in the mirror image version of that now, where we're trying to bolster a Western power that sees itself as being weakened by an Asian force? So
of course, the Chinese self-strengtheners, they weren't just about technology and institutional changes. They were also talking about guiding principles and concepts. There's this whole intellectual ferment, which Xi Jinping's speech yesterday entirely wrote out of Chinese history. But yes, I do mean that we need to do a fundamental rethink in much the same way.
We've got some questions that have come in, and let me just pose one question first to the panel in general, and then we'll move on to the audience questions. And again, if anyone has any, please send them into china@wilsoncenter.org. But I guess I wanted to just pose this as questions of devil's advocate. And we talked a lot about the bipartisan nature of the bill and the Washington consensus, but there are some people in Washington who've argued that this type of bill is unnecessary and maybe even dangerous, and might lead to it posits a sort of a quasi Cold War scenario, and it might lead to further tensions just on its own. So, for example, Michael Swain, who's a longtime China scholar and now is at the Quincy Institute, wrote a piece for the Quincy Institute recently where the headline addressing the bill called it a dangerous declaration of Cold War on China. And in one line, he said, in each section, the bill echoes the most extreme demonization rhetoric on China found in Washington today. And Xinhua, interestingly, picked up on those phrases and amplified them in one of its articles. So I just wanted to see, what the panelists think of that approach to the bill, or that take on the bill.
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. I mean, I think that there's some real pragmatism and realism in the criticism coming from the progressive left that, the rush into what could be a second and far more complicated Cold War than the Cold War that we lived through in the 20th century may not actually be in our own national interest and may do more harm than good. There's a lot to be thought about there. On the one hand, when we're talking about the ideological competition versus the performative competition of systems and which one works better, the idea of being organized around a China challenge in order to improve our own domestic economy and address our own domestic challenges is not necessarily a bad one. And certainly, I think whoever wins an ideological competition, if that's what it ends up being, it's likely going to be the side that wins the performance competition. And we need to be getting our own house in order in order to do that. But the reality is also that we're very much entangled with China commercially and in many other ways. And we can't simply put a wall up between us and expect to remain competitive. The reality is that there will be competition cost for the United States in simply ripping apart the relationship and then hoping that we can figure out ways to work around what previously were dependencies and entanglements, and overnight stand-up replacement operations elsewhere and here at home. That's just not going to happen. So I think that there's real pragmatism in the criticism, even if it's not what the rest of Congress is coalescing around yet.
Abe,
Great,
I'd love to
thanks.
hear your views on this question.
Thanks, Ed. I understand where folks like Michael Swain and others are coming from on this, but I disagree pretty strongly. One, the idea that a piece of legislation would have such epoch-defining implications, I think is challenging. But I also think that we need to look at the broader picture to put this in context. That just yesterday, I think, was when I think the speeches came when Xi Jinping made his big speech marking the 100th anniversary. One of the things he said was any external attempt to subjugate China would result in, quote, heads bashed bloodily against a great wall of steel, end quote. I don't know which would be more concerning in terms of inflaming Cold War tendencies or driving competitive dynamics in there, but I'd suggest that China at least has some part to play in that as well. I think it's natural and understandable for the United States to see what China's been doing in terms of acting with greater aggression and assertiveness across its periphery, especially when it comes to U.S. treaty allies. If you look at some of the actions it's been taking domestically, be it in Hong Kong, which we've already discussed, or Xinjiang, or even just across the country, establishing a more technologically based form of authoritarian rule, I think those have a part to play as well. And I think it makes sense for the United States to react to that, especially as it sees a rising China in increasingly competitive terms. And China is defining itself in increasingly competitive terms with the United States. I think China's rise is a part of that, but it's certainly not the only piece of that. There are other rising powers in the world. Yet you don't see a broad bipartisan consensus about the countering the rise of India. So I think there's the ideology, the form of the government that we have in China is an important place, has an important role in this competition. I don't see it as an ideological competition or an existential competition as some have. I think the competition is much more based on interests and competing visions of the future of the international order and especially of the Indo-Pacific. But those visions are defined by and influenced by our national ideologies. That I don't think you can create a Chinese approach to international affairs, their vision of the future of the international order, without including considerations of Chinese Communist Party ideology. Similarly with us. So I don't agree with Michael Swain's take on this or others like him who've criticized that, but I also don't see the competition as the existential threat that if we don't get this right, we're all going to be speaking Mandarin soon. I don't see it as that way either. I think that the center where I think a lot of people across the political divide sit, I think is more close to where the competition actually sits and probably gets us closer to successfully defending the interests and values that we hold in the United States and those of our allies and partners.
Great, thanks, Abe. I'm going to turn to the first audience question here. This is from Jack Shanahan at North Carolina State University. And he says, this question is for anyone, but probably best for Melissa and or Anna. Can a bill become too big for its own good? The panelists refer to the daunting size of this piece of legislation. It'll be a massive undertaking to track the requirements of the bill, and I fully expect most organizations, agencies, institutions, and individuals will throw up their hands in frustration when trying to understand what pieces and parts they might be responsible for. Granted, signaling is always part of any bill, and this one sends a big and crucial signal, but is there a danger of the tactical trees obscuring the strategic forest? Thanks.
I can take a first cut at that, and then I'll hand it off to Anna to finish off strongly and wrap up whatever I missed, or say something more eloquently than I did. I think this actually goes back to a comment that Abe made around understanding the context in which this happens. And as he was talking, I was sort of nodding vigorously. I think one of the things that's missing from this bill, it is incredibly expansive, and I think, as Robert pointed out, going to be incredibly expensive, and there's not a clear level of prioritization across those expenses. But I think the other thing that's missing is there's not a clear metric of success, right? So we've laid out what we think our geopolitical environment is, and you don't need to imagine a malicious, looming evil China in the background to have that competition. This is what states do when they jostle against each other and they have strategic interest to maintain those advantages. But the question that kind of comes on the other side of that is, what does our success for these various metrics look like? So if we want a world in which we are successful in this bill, that world is not going to be no China. That is not going to be the world that we live in, where China is just not dominant in any technology field, is not concerning from any security or diplomacy perspective, and we're not worried about them from an economic advantage. That is not going to be the future that we live in. So I think the real concern with this bill being so broad is we haven't really taken the time to talk about our priorities, our sequencing, right? Which is not just what do we want to do, but in what order do we want them to do them? Exactly where this falls in terms of specific technologies. Some of these are very technology specific. Chips, for example, U.S. telecommunications, those are very technology specific. Supply chain is not, right? That is an expansive ecosystem of which multiple technologies exist. And at the end of the day, what is the strategic world, the kind of metrics for success that these different kind of activities we're carrying out get us to, where we would be comfortable, where we would say in the long term and the short term, I am comfortable with this relationship with China in these areas. And I think that's missing as well. So in terms of forest through the trees, there's a lot happening there in terms of lack of prioritization, lack of funding. Some technological specification in areas could be incredibly handy, but also just that how are we measuring our success here? How do we know if this is successful? I think the Cold War analogy gets us is to our detriment here, which is it brings up a very different type of conflict, competition with a very different set of actors with a very different end goal set in mind. The end goal here is not no China. The end goal here is not zero interdependence globally with any country we don't like. The end goal here has to be how can the United States maximize on the technology front as much of our national strengths as possible to maintain positions of innovation, leadership, and security in those spaces and to be able to reap those benefits with our partners and our allies, and to the most extent possible, mitigate the risks of an untrusted vendor or a peer competitor in those spaces. And that's the China challenge. It's not how do we defeat China, get them on the ropes in our global economy. Those are very different kind of frames, but I'll hand off to Anna to sort of take it from there.
Okay, I will just add, I mean, I think that was a great closing actually all by itself. But, you know, I think the Senate deserves credit for being able to get legislation all the way through the process, at least in that house, that is sweeping and tries to articulate a new vision for the U.S. China relationship in the 21st century. Yes, there are problematic aspects, though, of having all of these different pieces shoved into one bill and put in there in a pretty rapid fire process that didn't create a lot of time for stakeholder input. Melissa said at the beginning that granularity is where the rubber meets the road, and certainly from an economic perspective, that's also the case. The devil is in the details, and there are a lot of details that, in our view, really haven't been ironed out yet, and really need to be ironed out in order for this to be actually beneficial for the U.S. economy overall. And so I guess we have to hope that if it does become law, that there is a very deliberate regulatory promulgation process where stakeholders get to weigh in, and all of those details are really considered after the fact.
Great, thank you. Thanks both Melissa and Anna. And we probably time for some brief answers to one more question. So I'll pose this to the panel, and this person is addressing something that Robert said earlier. This is from Anthony Chatham of Tulane. He says, Mr. Robert Daly argues that there's little dialogue concerning the course of direct diplomacy with China, but rather the dialogue is generalized to the Indo-Pacific region. However, in Section 4, Statement of Policy on page 29 in the Act, the Senate urges the U.S., quote, to cooperate with the PRC if interests align, including through bilateral or multilateral means and at the United Nations as appropriate. Isn't this one area where diplomacy between the U.S. and China can cooperate, particularly as the U.S. and China both share mutual interests in strategic security and non-proliferation agreements? And are there other potential areas of cooperation? So would anyone like to, maybe we can start with Robert, anyone else can chime in?
Very briefly, I had picked out that quote too. It contrasted with the spirit of much of the rest of the bill, but it's pretty vague and non-committal. It really says, cooperate with China, interests align, thingy, you know what I mean. And then it moves on again. So it's not really an area of cooperation. And this is, to get back to something that Melissa and Anna just said, this is a massive dog's breakfast of a bill. Almost anything that any senator or member of the House has said about China anytime over the past 5 years is reflected somewhere in these 2,400 pages. And so the question, I think, has to be, what is the broad thrust? There are a couple of places where there's a statement of interest in cooperation. And I think that is sincere, but the context in which it's put forward probably disinclines China to cooperate if it was inclined in the first place.
And Abe?
And just in the security milieu, I think there's two areas that the bill discusses that I thought deserved a little attention in the theme of dialogue. One being on a strategic dialogue on nuclear issues, saying that the United States should try to engage China bilaterally on these issues as part of other dialogues that it talks about. This has actually been something that the United States had sought from China since Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. Except for some early activity circa 2008, there's been very little interest from Beijing on engaging with the United States on these issues. But I do think it's an issue worth pursuing, especially considering the dramatic investments that China has been making in its nuclear capabilities. Something that I think definitely needs to be discussed, but not within the trilateral context that the Trump administration had sought to include it, which I think was unrealistic. The other area of cooperation I'd highlight in the security sector is space. There has been proposals in Congress from some to add amendments to various pieces of legislation that would permanently ban NASA from cooperating with China on space issues. In part because China doesn't really have a civilian space capability, that it's all driven by the military. But I'd also highlight that we were able to cooperate with the Soviet Union on space during the Cold War, which strikes me as something that if we could do that with an existential enemy like the Soviet Union, there might be some areas of potential for cooperation with China in space. But I do think that as Robert said, the broad statement of we need to cooperate with China and engage with them in dialogue on areas of mutual interest is about as broad as it gets, other than to have a statement that says something like we need to do a diplomacy thing with the Chinese. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of people running to their computers to establish new dialogues based on that section of the legislation. But I do think that the broad sense that we need to have more engagement with China, especially in areas of difficulty like nuclear weapons, like space, I think is something that the United States should consider pursuing.
Great, thanks a lot, Abe. And I think we're out of time now, but we've had a great discussion, and we actually had several great questions that we didn't get around to. So I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for signing in and listening. And thanks to Anna, Melissa, Abe, and Robert for giving us their great insights on this act. And we'll all be watching closely to see what happens with this legislation and whether it ends up at the White House. And then from there, what the US decides to do with it. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks.